The evening air was thick with an ominous stillness as Sarah walked along the dense forest path, the faint sound of her boots crunching against the dried leaves beneath her feet. It had been a long day of hiking through the quiet wilderness, but she had always found solace in these treks. Her thoughts wandered as the shadows of the trees stretched across the ground, darkening the path ahead of her. She'd come to the mountains to escape the noise of city life, hoping the isolation would help clear her mind. The bustling streets, the endless meetings, the constant pressure to be someone she wasn't. It had all been too much lately. The solitude of nature seemed like the perfect cure for her mind's chaos. But tonight felt different. There was something about the forest, something inexplicably unsettling. The trees were unusually silent, and the air had a crispness to it that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The farther she ventured, the more the feeling of unease gnawed at her. She wasn't sure if it was her imagination running wild, but the trees seemed to close in around her, their gnarled branches casting long, twisted shadows. Sarah paused to catch her breath and glanced around. She was deep in the woods now, far from the well-trodden paths she had taken earlier. The setting sun had long disappeared behind the mountains, and only the dim light of her flashlight guided her. As she took a few steps forward, her foot caught on something hard in the underbrush. She stumbled but quickly regained her balance. Cursing softly, she knelt to investigate the object that had tripped her. To her surprise, it wasn't a stone or a root, but a rusted metal ring. It was partially buried beneath the leaves and dirt, but it was unmistakable. Some sort of old hatch, as if something had been hidden here for years. Curiosity piqued. Sarah knelt closer and brushed away the dirt. The ring was cold and slick under her fingers. There was an eerie sensation as her hand touched it, as if the object were alive, waiting for her to unlock whatever secret it held. Her breath caught as she pulled on the ring, feeling resistance at first, but then it creaked open with a groan of rusted hinges. A sudden gust of wind swept through the trees, causing the leaves to rustle violently. Sarah shivered. It was as though the forest itself was urging her to stop, warning her to leave this place. But she couldn't. The allure of the unknown was far too great. She lifted the hatch fully, revealing a set of steep, narrow stairs leading down into what appeared to be an underground chamber. The air that rushed up from the opening was stale and cold, carrying with it the scent of something ancient and forgotten. The dim light of her flashlight barely illuminated the stairs, but there was something faintly glowing at the bottom, casting an eerie, pale blue light that flickered in the darkness. Without thinking, Sarah felt her feet moving toward the stairs, as if an invisible force were pulling her in. A sense of foreboding settled deep in her gut, but her curiosity overpowered her instincts. Taking a deep breath, she began her descent. The sound of her boots echoed in the narrow stairwell, the air growing colder with each step. She tried to shake off the sense of dread creeping up her spine, telling herself it was just her mind playing tricks. But the deeper she went, the more intense the feeling became, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. When Sarah reached the bottom, she was greeted by an immense stone chamber, its high walls carved with strange symbols she couldn't decipher. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and there was an oppressive silence that seemed to echo through the room. The pale blue light she had seen from above was coming from the center of the room, from a strange, shimmering portal that hung suspended in the air. It looked like a doorway, but not to any place she recognized. It was as if the very air around the portal was warping, bending and twisting in unnatural ways. The portal's edges shimmered and rippled like water, glowing faintly with a sickly hue. It was a sight that would have sent most people running in fear, but Sarah's curiosity had reached its peak. She stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest, as she moved closer to the glowing anomaly. The moment she crossed the threshold of the portal, a chill unlike anything she had ever experienced washed over her. It felt as though time itself had stopped. The sounds of the forest above her, the world she had known, seemed distant and irrelevant now. She was somewhere else, somewhere beyond the realm of reality. Her senses were overwhelmed by the raw power emanating from the portal. Suddenly, a voice, low and guttural, echoed in her mind. It was not a sound she had heard, but something that came from deep within her thoughts, as if the voice were inside her very soul. "You should not have come here." The voice sent a shockwave of terror through her body, but before she could react, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The air grew thicker, heavier, as if the portal were pulling her into another world, a world where she did not belong. Panic surged within her as the voice spoke again. Louder this time, "You cannot leave." The shimmering portal seemed to stretch and distort as if it were alive, twisting in impossible ways. The air around Sarah grew suffocating, and she stumbled backward, her breath shallow and frantic. She turned to flee, but the entrance to the portal was no longer visible. The chamber she had entered was now a labyrinth of shifting walls, the path back to the stairs completely gone. Desperation clawed at her as she frantically searched for a way out, but the walls continued to shift, trapping her in an endless, twisting maze of darkness. The voice continued to whisper, growing louder and more frantic with each passing second. "You are mine now." And just as Sarah felt the last remnants of her hope slip away, a shadowy figure emerged from the darkness in front of her, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. The figure reached out toward her with long, gnarled fingers, and in that moment, Sarah realized the horrifying truth. She had awakened something far more ancient and far more dangerous than she could ever imagine. The darkness closed in around her. The darkness swallowed Sarah whole, the labyrinthine walls closing in tighter and tighter. The strange figure that had appeared in the shadows was just the beginning. Her heart hammered in her chest, each beat louder than the last, each one filled with dread. The glowing eyes of the entity, its gnarled fingers outstretched, inching toward her, sent waves of terror rippling through her. It was too late to turn back now. There was no way out. The portal had consumed her, pulling her into its unknown depths. But the more she tried to run, the more she felt the weight of the unseen forces pressing down on her. The walls twisted and contorted, their shapes shifting in ways that defied logic. Each turn she took only seemed to lead her deeper into the maze, further from any hope of escape. The voice, low and guttural, rang out again in her mind. "You cannot leave. You are mine now." The words echoed and reverberated through her skull, making her head spin. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her skin clammy with cold sweat as she stumbled blindly through the corridor. She had to focus. She had to find a way out before it was too late. Her hands grazed the cold, uneven walls, the stone slick beneath her fingers. The air smelled of decay, of rot, as if this place had been forgotten by time itself. She couldn't tell if the tremors shaking the ground were caused by her fear or something else, something far worse. The whispers in her mind grew louder, more urgent. "The path you take has already been chosen. You will join us, just as all the others have." The ground shifted beneath her feet, and she stumbled, crashing into the floor with a painful thud. Her flashlight flew from her grip, skittering across the floor, its beam illuminating strange, twisted shapes etched into the stone. The markings were unlike anything she had ever seen, ancient symbols that pulsed with an eerie, unsettling energy. Panic surged within her as she scrambled to her feet. She could feel something following her. She could hear the faintest of footsteps behind her, their rhythm slow but deliberate. Her mind raced, her thoughts clouded by the fear that threatened to overtake her. She knew she had to get away, but where? Where was there to run? The whispering voices seemed to surround her, closing in from all sides, suffocating her. Her head spun, and she could no longer tell which way was up or down, left or right. She had entered the heart of the underworld, a place where time had no meaning, where the rules of the physical world no longer applied. Then, through the growing panic, Sarah felt a sudden shift in the air, a faint warmth, almost as if the room were alive. The oppressive chill that had followed her since she stepped into this cursed place dissipated, replaced by an almost inviting heat. The sensation made her pause. She looked around, her eyes wide with confusion. Was this a trap? Was she being lured into something far more sinister? She didn't know, but something compelled her to move forward. The walls of the labyrinth seemed to open up before her, parting like a curtain to reveal a grand, ancient hall. The floor beneath her feet was made of polished black stone, glistening like obsidian. Tall columns lined the sides of the room, their surfaces covered in strange runes that pulsed with an eerie glow. At the far end of the hall, a massive door stood ajar, its wooden surface warped and cracked as if it had been standing for centuries. A deep, guttural growl echoed from somewhere in the shadows, followed by a shrill, otherworldly scream that seemed to vibrate through her very bones. Her stomach lurched. The air was thick with an oppressive, suffocating presence, a feeling that she was being watched, stalked, even. It was a sensation unlike any other, and she had to fight the overwhelming urge to flee. But the door was the only way forward. Her legs felt like lead as she forced herself to move toward it, each step heavy with dread. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking straight into the belly of the beast, that whatever awaited her on the other side of that door would be the end of her. But there was no turning back. The closer she got, the louder the growls and whispers became, merging into a cacophony of torment. They filled her head, reverberating in her mind until she could hardly tell what was real anymore. As she reached the door, she hesitated, her hand trembling as it hovered just above the handle. The moment she touched it, the temperature in the room plummeted. A burst of cold air shot through the hall, sending a shiver up her spine. With a deep breath, she turned the handle, pushing the door open. What lay beyond was even more horrifying than she could have imagined. The room was vast, stretching out endlessly in all directions, an abyss that seemed to swallow everything whole. The walls, if they could be called walls, were made of writhing shadows, twisted and contorted like living things. In the center of the room, a massive stone altar stood, covered in bloodstains that had long since dried. The stench of death hung heavy in the air. And then, she saw them, figures, dark and twisted, standing motionless at the edges of the room, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They were watching her, waiting for her. A voice broke through the deafening silence, a voice that made her blood run cold. "You should have never come here." The figure that spoke was tall and gaunt, its face obscured by a hood that seemed to absorb the light around it. It stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. As it approached, the shadows that clung to its form seemed to stretch and writhe, as if they had a life of their own. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, but there was nowhere to run. The door behind her slammed shut with an ear-splitting bang, sealing her in the chamber with the figures. The creature in front of her tilted its head, as if studying her, before it spoke again. "You are trapped. You are ours now." Suddenly, the altar began to tremble, the stone vibrating beneath her feet. A low, rumbling sound filled the room, and the shadows seemed to converge on the altar, swirling around it like a vortex. The figures stepped forward, their hands raised toward her, their eyes burning with an unholy hunger. The room seemed to close in on her as the shadows reached out, wrapping around her body, pulling her toward the altar. And then, just as she felt the first cold, skeletal fingers brush against her skin, the world around her went dark. Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps, her chest heaving as the shadows closed in on her. The dark figures, their eyes glowing with a cold, unearthly light, surrounded her, their movements synchronized and deliberate. Their voices whispered in unison, filling the chamber with a haunting cadence that reverberated deep within her bones. "You belong to us now," the words echoed in her mind, louder than any sound she had ever heard, and she stumbled backward, her legs trembling beneath her. Her hands gripped the altar's edge for support, her fingers cold and slick with sweat. She could feel the power in the air, thick and suffocating, pressing down on her chest as if the room itself were alive, feeding off her fear. The shadows swirled around her, their tendrils reaching out, wrapping around her arms, pulling her closer to the altar. Each touch sent a jolt of icy terror through her, as if the darkness itself were consuming her very essence. She fought against the pull, her mind racing for a way out, but the more she struggled, the tighter the shadows seemed to hold her. "Please no," she whispered, her voice trembling with desperation. "I don't belong here." But the figures paid her no heed. They continued their slow, deliberate march toward her, their eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. The figure at the front, the one who had spoken earlier, raised a hand, and the shadows seemed to obey its command, tightening their grip on her. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to break free. She was trapped. There was nowhere to go, nothing she could do to escape. Her only hope lay in the altar, the strange, ancient stone slab at the center of the room. It seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, its surface covered in dark stains that gleamed in the dim light. The figure's voice broke through her thoughts again, low and mocking. "You cannot escape. You have entered our domain. Now you will be part of it." Her eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of a way out. The walls were no longer solid. They seemed to flicker and distort, warping and twisting like living creatures. The figures, too, seemed to shift, their forms flickering in and out of focus. For a moment, Sarah thought she saw something moving behind them, something far larger and more terrifying than the figures that surrounded her. But then, before she could make sense of it, the figure at the front of the group stepped forward, its hand outstretched. The air around it seemed to shimmer, and a pulse of cold energy hit Sarah with the force of a physical blow. The shadows recoiled, and for the briefest of moments, she was free. She took a step back, heart racing, but her escape was short-lived. The room seemed to shift again, the walls twisting and turning in impossible ways. The air grew thicker, more oppressive, and the figures advanced once more, their footsteps silent but heavy. The figure with the hood tilted its head, its glowing eyes fixed on her with an eerie calmness. "You cannot run. You cannot hide. This is your fate now." Suddenly, a loud, echoing sound filled the room, like the cracking of ancient stone. The altar trembled beneath her hands, and the shadows recoiled as if in fear. The figure at the front raised both hands, and the ground beneath Sarah's feet rumbled ominously. "It is time," it intoned, its voice deep and resonant. "The ritual begins." Before Sarah could react, the shadows surged forward, wrapping around her body, lifting her off the ground. The figures chanted in unison, their voices blending into a single, haunting sound that seemed to reverberate through every fiber of her being. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly as the energy in the room shifted. The altar before her seemed to glow with an intense, otherworldly light, and Sarah's vision blurred as the shadows closed in tighter. She struggled, but the force was too strong. The shadows tightened their grip, their cold, skeletal hands pressing into her skin, draining her strength. She could feel the energy being siphoned from her, her life force ebbing away with each passing second. And then, just as she thought she could no longer fight, a bright flash of light erupted from the altar, blinding her. The room seemed to shudder as the shadows recoiled, pulling away from her in fear. The chanting ceased, replaced by a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from the very earth itself. For a moment, the figures were frozen, their eyes wide in shock as the light from the altar flared brighter. It was as if the very fabric of the underworld was tearing apart. Sarah gasped for air, the oppressive weight of the darkness lifting for a brief moment. Her head spun, and she could barely focus as she looked up at the altar. A figure stood there, bathed in the glowing light, its form shifting and pulsating like a living shadow. It was tall, its body made of darkness, but it was not one of the figures that had surrounded her. This entity was different. It radiated power, its presence overwhelming. Its eyes, glowing with an unnatural light, locked onto Sarah's with an intensity that made her stomach churn. And then it spoke, its voice a deep, resonant growl that seemed to come from all around her. "You are not meant to be here." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The words felt like a warning, but it was too late. The entity raised a hand, and a blast of dark energy shot toward her, striking her with the force of a thunderclap. The room erupted into chaos. The walls shook, and the shadows writhed and twisted, their forms disintegrating into nothingness. The altar cracked open, and a deep, thunderous roar echoed through the chamber. As Sarah was thrown backward, the world around her seemed to explode. The light from the altar flickered one last time before it went dark. And then everything went silent. The silence that followed the explosion of dark energy was suffocating. Sarah lay on the cold, stone floor, her body throbbing with pain. Her head spun, and her chest felt tight as if she had been holding her breath for hours. The world around her was dark and still, the only sound the faint crackle of the altar's remains. She struggled to sit up, her limbs heavy and unresponsive. The air was thick with the scent of burning wood and ancient stone, and the oppressive weight of the underworld's presence still lingered in the room. Her vision was blurry, and for a moment, she thought she had lost consciousness. But when she blinked, she saw the shattered remnants of the altar glowing faintly in the distance. The dark energy that had surged through the room earlier was now gone, but the presence of something malevolent still hung in the air. Her skin crawled with the sensation of being watched, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She could feel the eyes of the unseen entity on her, its gaze burning through the darkness like a predator tracking its prey. With great effort, Sarah pushed herself to her feet. Her legs wobbled beneath her, and she had to steady herself on the jagged remnants of the altar. She couldn't understand what had just happened. The room had erupted in chaos, and now everything was still, unnaturally so. The figure she had seen standing in the light was gone. The shadows had receded, leaving only the faint, glowing remnants of the altar. But the feeling of danger was stronger than ever. Something was wrong. As she glanced around the room, her eyes landed on the far corner, where the dark portal had once stood. The swirling energy that had been there was gone, replaced by an ominous void. It was as if the portal had never existed, but she knew better. She could still feel its pull, the way it called to her, urging her to step forward. The room seemed to close in on her as she took a hesitant step toward the void. The walls no longer flickered. They were solid, but something was different, more oppressive, more alive. The temperature had dropped even further, and the air felt thick, as though the room itself were suffocating her. A sound broke the silence. It was faint at first, like the rustling of cloth, but then it grew louder, more distinct. Footsteps. Someone, or something, was moving behind her. She whipped around, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure from before, the one bathed in dark energy, appeared before her once more. It was the same figure, but now it was clearer. It wasn't just made of shadows anymore. The entity had taken form, its body solid, yet its edges seemed to bleed into the darkness around it, as though it were part of the room itself. Its eyes glowed an unnatural, fiery red, and its presence was overwhelming, like a force of nature she could not comprehend. "You should not have come here." The voice that emanated from the entity was deep, guttural, and it resonated within her chest, making her feel as if her very soul was vibrating with fear. Sarah tried to take a step back, but her feet felt as though they were glued to the ground. The room seemed to close in around her as the entity advanced, its glowing eyes never leaving hers. The shadows that had once been her prison were now her only allies, but they too seemed to recoil at the entity's presence, as if they feared it. "You are not the one who belongs here," the entity continued, its voice dripping with malice. "You have opened the door. Now you must face the consequences." Sarah's mind raced. She had no idea what this creature wanted from her, or how it had come to be. The altar, the portal, the strange energy. It all felt like a dream, a nightmare she couldn't wake from. But this was no dream. She could feel the heat from the entity's gaze searing her skin, the cold from the void at her back freezing her to the core. I don't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean to open anything. I don't know how I ended up here." The entity's lips twisted into something that could have been a smile, though it was devoid of any warmth. "You have already crossed the threshold. Now there is no escape. You are ours as much as the rest of them." Suddenly, the ground beneath Sarah trembled. The stone floor cracked, and a low, rumbling sound filled the room. The walls began to distort again, but this time, the shifts weren't merely flickering. Something far darker was happening. The walls seemed to bend and twist in impossible ways, and Sarah could hear faint, tortured cries from somewhere deep within the stone, as if the very foundation of the building was screaming. Her heart pounded louder than the rumbling around her. She had to get out. She had to escape, or she would be consumed by whatever dark force this entity represented. "You cannot leave," the entity said, its voice cutting through her thoughts like a knife. "The portal is already closed to you. You have seen too much. You cannot escape." Sarah's mind raced, searching for any means of survival. She couldn't give up. She had to find a way out, but the fear was paralyzing. The room was collapsing around her, the shadows shifting and writhing as if they were alive. The entity before her was closing in, its red eyes glowing brighter, its form becoming more solid with each passing second. Just as Sarah thought she was about to be engulfed by the darkness, a flash of light exploded through the room, bright, blinding, and intense. She shielded her eyes, but the force of it knocked her back. "No!" the entity roared, its form flickering violently as the light pushed it back. "You cannot stop it." But the light didn't falter. It grew stronger, brighter, until the entire room was filled with a blinding radiance. The walls cracked, the shadows screamed, and the ground beneath Sarah's feet shattered. She closed her eyes, bracing for the inevitable. But nothing happened. When she opened her eyes, the room was gone. The entity, the altar, the portal, it had all vanished. She was standing in a vast, empty void, the silence deafening around her. The cold was unbearable, and the darkness stretched on forever. But in the distance, Sarah saw something. A figure, tall and shadowed, yet it radiated power, much like the entity she had just faced. This new figure was different, though. Its presence felt familiar, like something she had seen before. "You are not safe yet." The voice was deep and resonant, like thunder in the distance. "You have opened the door to the underworld. You must face your fate." And then, everything went black. The darkness was suffocating. Every inch of Sarah's body screamed for air, but there was none. The vast void she found herself in seemed to stretch endlessly, like an infinite expanse with no way out. The cold clung to her skin, biting at her very soul. But what terrified her more than the cold was the silence. It was an oppressive silence, the kind that presses against your chest and makes your heart race. She could feel the weight of it pressing down on her, threatening to crush her into oblivion. Her breath was shallow, and her mind was a whirlwind of confusion. Had she truly escaped, or was this yet another twisted part of the underworld she had stumbled into? She couldn't remember how she had gotten here. One moment, she was in the ruins of the ancient temple, facing that dark entity, and now she was here, lost in this abyss. She tried to call out, but her voice was swallowed by the emptiness, disappearing into nothingness. Panic began to claw at the edges of her sanity. Where was she? What was happening? The feeling of being watched crept over her again, and her heart skipped a beat. It was different this time, though. It wasn't just the subtle sensation of someone lurking in the shadows. It was something more visceral. The air felt charged, alive with a malevolent presence. Sarah shivered, instinctively wrapping her arms around herself in a futile attempt to ward off the invisible force. And then she heard it, a whisper. It was faint at first, like a breeze rustling through dead leaves. But as it grew louder, it became clear. "You cannot escape." Sarah froze. The voice was low and rasping, like the sound of stones scraping against metal. It was the same voice from before, the entity she had encountered in the temple. But why was it here? What was it doing in this vast, void-like space? "You think you can escape?" The voice continued, its tone mocking and filled with an ancient, knowing cruelty. "You opened the door, Sarah. You invited me in. Now you will pay the price." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't deny it. She had opened the portal. Her curiosity, her need to understand, had led her to this point. She had done it without realizing the consequences. And now she was trapped in a world that wasn't hers. A world that wanted to consume her. The darkness around her seemed to grow thicker, pressing in from all sides. She could hear the sound of something moving through it, the unmistakable shuffle of feet. The sensation of being surrounded grew stronger, and Sarah's pulse quickened. She wasn't alone here. Something was approaching. "I will make you pay for your trespass." The voice hissed, closer now, more present than ever. "You belong to the underworld now, Sarah. There is no going back." Her feet felt like lead, frozen in place as the shuffling sounds grew louder. The air thickened with an unnatural energy, and Sarah's mind raced for an escape. She could feel the walls of her reality closing in, but there was no way out. No doors, no windows, just an endless expanse of nothingness. And then she saw it, a faint light in the distance. It was dim, almost ethereal, but it was something. A glimpse of hope. Sarah didn't think. She ran. The sound of her footsteps was muted by the thick air, but she could feel the ground beneath her feet, solid and unyielding. The light ahead grew brighter with each step, a beacon in the dark that promised something more than the crushing weight of the void. The whispers grew louder, but she refused to listen. She had to reach the light. She had to escape whatever horror was hunting her. As she ran, the darkness seemed to bend around her, trying to pull her back, but she pushed forward, her heart pounding in her chest. The light was getting closer now, just a few more steps, and she would be free. But then, the ground beneath her feet gave way. She fell. The sensation of falling was immediate and disorienting. Her body tumbled through the darkness, weightless, as if she were being pulled into the very core of the void. Panic surged through her, and she reached out, grasping at the empty air in a futile attempt to stop her descent. But it was no use. The force of gravity was relentless, and she plunged deeper and deeper into the abyss. Her stomach lurched as she fell, her mind screaming in terror. She had to stop falling. She had to land. But there was no ground, no end. The darkness stretched on, endless, swallowing her whole. Just when she thought she couldn't fall any further, the air shifted. A sudden gust of wind surrounded her, and the sensation of falling ceased. She was still in the void, but now, the darkness seemed to be thinning, as if something was breaking through it. Her feet touched the ground with a heavy thud, and she stumbled, barely catching herself before she fell again. The fall had left her disoriented, but she quickly regained her balance, her instincts kicking in. She wasn't alone. She could feel it. The air was no longer still. It was thick with tension, filled with a sense of waiting. She had been brought somewhere new. She didn't know where, but the oppressive feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. Slowly, she turned around, her breath catching in her throat. The darkness was parting before her eyes, and she could see figures emerging from the shadows. They were tall, impossibly tall, their forms obscured by the mist that rolled in from the edges of the void. Their faces were hidden in the darkness, but Sarah could feel their eyes on her, boring into her very soul. "You've come too far, Sarah," a voice whispered from the shadows. It was soft, almost gentle, but there was a malice beneath it that made Sarah's blood run cold. She wanted to run, but her body wouldn't move. The weight of their presence was too much. She was trapped in a place where the laws of reality no longer applied. "You belong to us now," the voice continued, its tone low and hypnotic. "There is no escaping the underworld. There is no way back." And then, the figures stepped forward, their faces still hidden in the mist, but their presence undeniable. The temperature dropped, and Sarah felt the air grow colder with each step they took. They were closing in on her, surrounding her, their intentions clear. Sarah's heart raced in her chest, and the terror that had been building inside her finally erupted. She tried to scream, but her voice was caught in her throat. Her body trembled uncontrollably as the figures grew closer, their shapes becoming clearer in the dim light. One of them raised a hand, and the world around her seemed to shift. The ground beneath her feet became unstable, the air thickened, and the shadows around her grew deeper, more oppressive. She was trapped. There was no way out. But as she felt herself slipping into the suffocating darkness, a sudden thought pierced through her panic. There has to be a way out. The darkness wrapped around Sarah like a suffocating blanket. Her chest tightened with fear, and she could hear the pounding of her heart in her ears. The figures were almost upon her now, their cold, ethereal forms casting long shadows that stretched across the floor. The temperature had dropped even further, and Sarah's breath came out in visible puffs of air, each one disappearing into the chilling void. She stood frozen, trapped between the endless abyss and the creatures that seemed to embody the very essence of this nightmarish world. They were so close now, their faces still obscured by the swirling mist that surrounded them. But she could feel their eyes, cold, merciless, and calculating. They were watching her, studying her every movement, waiting for her to make a mistake. "You can't run, Sarah," one of them whispered in a voice that slithered into her mind, sending a shiver down her spine. It wasn't the voice of a person. It was more like the echo of something ancient, something that had lived in the shadows for millennia. You belong here now. There is no escaping what you've unleashed. Sarah's mind raced. There had to be a way out. She couldn't give up. She couldn't let this place claim her. Not when she was so close. Not when she had fought so hard to survive. Her eyes darted around, desperately searching for anything that could help her escape. But the void around her seemed to stretch on forever, a never-ending sea of darkness. There was no door, no window, no exit. She was trapped, surrounded by these creatures that seemed to be both part of the void and something far worse. Suddenly, one of the figures moved closer. It was tall, so tall that it seemed to bend and distort the very air around it. Its long, skeletal fingers reached out towards Sarah, and for a moment, she thought she saw a face beneath the swirling mist. But it wasn't a face like any she had ever seen before. It was twisted, contorted, as if the creature had no true form, no true identity. "You're afraid," the creature said, its voice like the grinding of metal against stone. "You fear what we can do to you, but fear is just the beginning, Sarah. What awaits you here is far worse than anything you can imagine." Sarah could feel her legs shaking, but she forced herself to stand tall. She refused to let them see her fear. She had to stay strong. She had to fight. But how? Her thoughts flickered back to the portal, the ancient stone archway that had appeared in the temple. She had opened it without understanding what it truly was. A portal to the underworld, to a place where nothing was as it seemed, where time and space twisted together in a chaotic dance. And now she was paying the price. The creature took another step forward, its presence growing more oppressive with each passing second. "You should have never come here," it said, its voice laced with malice. "This is where you belong now, in the dark with us, forever." Sarah's mind raced. She couldn't let it end like this. She couldn't give up without a fight. There had to be something she could do. She had to break free. In that moment, something deep within her stirred. A spark, a flicker of something long buried. She wasn't alone. She didn't have to face this alone. She reached deep within herself, pushing past the fear and the overwhelming sense of helplessness. And there it was, a glimmer of hope, a surge of energy, as if the very world around her had started to shift, responding to her will. The creature paused, sensing the change in the air. Its cold, empty eyes locked onto Sarah's. "What are you doing?" it hissed, its voice filled with both curiosity and dread. "You cannot escape. You are ours now." But Sarah wasn't listening. She had found something inside herself, a strength she didn't know she had. She wasn't going to be consumed by this place, not without a fight. With every ounce of strength she could muster, Sarah stepped forward, her hand outstretched toward the creature. A pulse of energy surged through her, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to shudder. The mist around the creature rippled, distorting and warping as if it were made of nothing more than smoke. The creature recoiled, a strange, guttural sound escaping its throat. "No," it howled. "You cannot. You cannot." But Sarah didn't stop. She pushed forward, her hand glowing with a strange, otherworldly light. The air around her hummed with power, and for the first time since she had entered this nightmarish world, she felt in control. The creatures around her recoiled, their forms flickering like shadows. They were afraid. For the first time, they were afraid. "You cannot banish us," the creature said, its voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. "You cannot destroy what you have summoned." But Sarah didn't answer. She knew what she had to do. She had to close the portal. She had to stop the underworld from claiming her. If she didn't, it would consume her and everyone she loved. With a final burst of energy, Sarah reached out, and the world around her seemed to explode in a flash of light. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything went dark. When Sarah opened her eyes again, she was lying on the ground. The air around her was still. The oppressive weight of the underworld had lifted, and for a moment, she thought she had won. She thought she had escaped. But when she looked up, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The portal was still there. It hadn't closed. It was still open, still pulsating with an eerie, dark light. And from the depths of that portal, something was emerging. Something far worse than the creatures she had faced. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as she stared at the portal. The faint, otherworldly glow radiated from it, casting eerie shadows across the ground. The air around her was still, too still, and the silence was suffocating. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to believe that she had won. But deep down, she knew it wasn't over. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and a low, guttural growl echoed from the depths of the portal. Her stomach churned with a sense of dread, and she could feel the temperature drop even further. It was as if the world around her was holding its breath, waiting for something to emerge. No, she thought, pushing herself to her feet. This can't be happening. I closed the portal. I made sure of it. But the dark, swirling energy that pulsed from the archway told a different story. It was still open, and the power emanating from it was growing stronger with each passing second. Sarah backed away slowly, her legs shaking beneath her. She knew she couldn't run, not from whatever was about to come through that portal. But she had to try. She had to find a way to close it for good, or else. A shadow flickered at the edge of her vision. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, a trick of the light. But then it appeared again, this time much closer. The figure. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she watched the figure step out from the portal. It was tall, towering over her, its form obscured by the thick shadows that clung to it like a cloak. The figure's face was hidden, but she could feel its eyes on her, cold, malevolent, and full of hunger. The creature's presence was suffocating, and Sarah could feel the very air grow heavier, like the weight of the world had descended upon her shoulders. She wanted to scream, to run, but she couldn't move. It was as if the creature's power had rooted her to the spot, leaving her frozen in place. The figure took another step forward, its long, clawed hands reaching out toward her. "You've made a terrible mistake, Sarah," a voice hissed. It wasn't the voice of the creature, but something deeper, something ancient and insidious. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, wrapping itself around her like chains. Sarah's mind raced, her heart pounding in her ears. This was it. The moment she had feared since the moment she stepped into this cursed place. She had unleashed something beyond her comprehension. Something that had been waiting in the shadows, patient and relentless. "You cannot close the portal," the voice continued, growing louder and more insistent. "You are not strong enough. You are nothing but a fleeting moment in the endless cycle. You belong to us now. There is no escape." Sarah clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She couldn't let it win. She couldn't let it consume her. "Think, Sarah, think," she screamed in her mind. "What do I do?" The portal pulsed, and the ground beneath her feet trembled again. The air was thick with an oppressive energy that made it difficult to breathe. Sweat beaded on Sarah's forehead as she looked up at the creature. No, the thing that was stepping closer to her with every passing second. Its form was more defined now, and she could see its glowing eyes, the hollow pits that seemed to pull in the very light around them. She could feel its power radiating off of it, a force so dark, so ancient, that it felt like it was reaching into her very soul. But then, something shifted. A small flicker of light, a memory, A spark ignited within her. The portal. She remembered the first time she had seen it. The symbol. The strange markings on the stone archway. It had all been so confusing, so overwhelming. But now, as the creature loomed closer, it clicked. The symbol. It wasn't just a decoration. It was a seal. A seal to keep something in. Something that had been waiting to be freed for far too long. With a surge of determination, Sarah pushed past her fear and reached into her pocket. Her fingers brushed against the cold metal of the small, intricate key she had found earlier. The key she hadn't yet understood the importance of. She hadn't known why she kept it, but now, she realized that it was the key to closing the portal. The key to stopping the creature from fully emerging into this world. Without hesitating, Sarah gripped the key tightly in her hand and rushed toward the portal. The darkness seemed to push back against her, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. As she reached the edge of the portal, she placed the key into the lock. A lock she hadn't even realized was there. The moment the key touched the stone, a shockwave of energy rippled through the air, and the portal seemed to scream in agony. The creature howled in fury, its form flickering and distorting as it fought against the energy now surging through the archway. "No," it roared. "You cannot close it. You cannot stop me." But Sarah didn't waver. She turned the key, and with a final, deafening scream from the portal, the dark energy began to recede. The air grew warmer, and the oppressive weight lifted from her chest. The portal began to shrink, its swirling darkness collapsing in on itself like a dying star. But just as it seemed like the nightmare was over, Sarah felt a sharp, cold pain shoot through her chest. She gasped, clutching her heart, and looked down. Her skin was beginning to crack, as if something was trying to break free from within her. The creature's voice echoed in her mind, now a whisper of rage. "You may have closed the portal, Sarah, but you cannot erase what you've done. The darkness will always find its way back. And next time, there will be no escape." The pain intensified, and Sarah screamed in agony, feeling the cold, dark energy seeping into her very soul. The pain in Sarah's chest was unbearable. She could feel the darkness pushing through her veins, crawling beneath her skin like ice-cold tendrils. Her breath was shallow, each exhale ragged and strained as if the very life was being drawn from her. The darkness that had threatened to escape the portal now seemed to be consuming her from within. It was as if the curse of the underworld had marked her, a punishment for her defiance. She staggered back from the now shrunken portal, clutching her chest in a desperate attempt to ease the burning pain. The world around her began to blur, the edges of her vision darkening. She felt dizzy, as if the ground beneath her were shifting, threatening to swallow her whole. But despite the agony coursing through her body, she couldn't afford to collapse. Not now. Not when she had just narrowly escaped one nightmare only to find herself facing another. As the portal continued to collapse in on itself, Sarah's mind raced. The creature's voice echoed in her ears, its chilling whispers lingering like a shadow in the back of her mind. "You cannot escape, Sarah. The price has been set. You are ours now." Her head spun. She had closed the portal, hadn't she? She had turned the key, stopped the dark forces from fully emerging. But it seemed that wasn't enough. The creature's words were now imprinted in her mind, and the curse was already starting to take hold. Sarah took one unsteady step back, her legs trembling beneath her. She glanced around, searching for something, anything, that could explain what was happening to her. But there was nothing. No answers, no escape. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice barely a rasp. The answer came, not in words, but in a pulse of cold energy that seemed to emanate from deep within her. Her body trembled, and she felt the overwhelming urge to collapse, but she fought it. She had to stay conscious. She had to find a way out. As she struggled to stay on her feet, she realized that the world around her was changing. The once familiar forest now seemed wrong. The trees twisted unnaturally, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands, their leaves blackened and withered. The sky above had turned a sickly shade of red, casting an eerie glow over everything. The ground beneath her feet was no longer solid. It was shifting, as if the earth itself were alive, twisting and writhing beneath her. This wasn't the world she had known. This wasn't even her world. She had crossed over. The portal hadn't just opened a passage for the creature to emerge. It had torn open the very fabric of reality itself, pulling Sarah into the underworld. And now she was trapped. A low growl rumbled in the distance, sending a chill down Sarah's spine. She turned slowly, her heart pounding, and saw a pair of glowing eyes in the shadows. They watched her, unblinking, as the growl grew louder. Something was coming. Panic surged through her, and Sarah's legs gave way beneath her. She fell to the ground, her hands scraping against the rough earth. The pain in her chest was growing worse, now accompanied by an unnatural, burning sensation in her limbs. It felt as though something was crawling beneath her skin, twisting and burrowing its way deeper into her body. "No," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I won't let this happen. I won't become like them." She forced herself to her feet again, ignoring the pain. Her body was fighting her, but she refused to give in. She had to find a way back to the world she knew. There had to be a way to reverse whatever had been done. The growling grew louder, and the ground trembled beneath her feet. The creatures were closing in. Sarah's eyes darted around, searching for any sign of an escape. But there was nothing, only the twisted, nightmarish landscape that stretched endlessly before her. "There is no escape, Sarah," the voice whispered again, this time in her mind. It was louder now, clearer. "You cannot outrun your fate. You belong to us, forever." She gritted her teeth, willing herself to focus. She couldn't let the creature win. She had to keep moving, keep fighting. The growl erupted into a roar, and Sarah spun around just in time to see a shadowy figure charge toward her, its glowing eyes burning with hunger. She barely had time to react before the creature lunged at her, its claws slashing through the air. Sarah dodged to the side, her breath catching in her throat. She had no weapon, no way to defend herself against the creature. Her only hope was to outrun it. But as she turned to flee, the ground beneath her feet cracked open, and she was sucked into the earth. The darkness swallowed her whole. The darkness enveloped Sarah like a suffocating blanket. She had barely any time to scream before the earth swallowed her whole, dragging her into a pit of endless black. Her limbs flailed as she fell, and the sensation of weightlessness made her stomach churn. The air felt thick, dense, and suffocating, as though the very atmosphere was pressing against her body. For what felt like an eternity, Sarah plummeted through the black void, the silence broken only by the thudding of her heartbeat in her ears. She couldn't see, couldn't make sense of what was happening. Her mind raced, her thoughts jumbled as she tried to make sense of the impossible nightmare she was in. Every part of her screamed to wake up, but she knew that this wasn't a dream. It was far too real. The cold was the first thing she noticed. It was so cold, it felt like the air itself had frozen her from the inside out. Her breath came out in short, sharp gasps, but the chill persisted, gnawing at her bones. She tried to move, but her body felt paralyzed, weighed down by an invisible force. Then, just as suddenly as the fall had begun, it stopped. Sarah crashed onto a hard, jagged surface, her body slamming against the cold ground. Pain shot through her limbs, but she barely had time to react before she realized something was wrong. She couldn't see a thing. The darkness had swallowed her whole, leaving her completely blind. Her heart raced, her breathing becoming shallow as panic set in. She tried to stand, to crawl, to move in any direction, but the sense of being completely lost in the dark was overwhelming. Her hands brushed against rough, uneven stone, and she could feel the air around her grow even colder. Her skin prickled with an unnatural chill, and she was suddenly aware that this place, whatever it was not just devoid of light. It was void of warmth, of life. "Where am I?" she whispered into the darkness, but her voice was swallowed by the emptiness, the silence so profound it felt suffocating. She had no idea where the portal had taken her, or how far she had fallen. But she knew one thing for sure. She was no longer in the world she knew. A low, distant growl echoed through the darkness. It sent a wave of icy terror through Sarah's chest, and she froze, her senses heightened. Her eyes strained in the blackness, desperate for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the oppressive silence and the cold that seemed to seep into her very soul. The growl came again, louder this time, much closer. The air shifted, the temperature dropping even further, and the ground beneath her began to tremble. Her pulse quickened, panic rising within her chest as she realized that she wasn't alone. Whatever was in the dark with her, it was coming closer. Her breath hitched in her throat, and she stumbled backward, trying to push herself away from the sound. But there was nowhere to go. The ground was unforgiving, and the darkness was impenetrable. She could hear something moving, scraping, dragging, as though something was crawling just beneath the surface of the earth. "Please," Sarah muttered under her breath, her heart pounding against her ribcage. "Let me go back. Let me out." But there was no answer, only the sound of something closing in on her. Suddenly, a sharp, high-pitched shriek pierced the silence, cutting through the dark like a blade. It was a horrible sound, like a tortured scream, and it sent chills up her spine. Sarah's body went rigid with fear. Her mind screamed at her to move, to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the oppressive blackness that seemed to swirl and shift around her. Then, from the corner of her eye, a faint glimmer of light appeared. It was so faint, so small that Sarah wasn't sure if she had imagined it, but she saw it. A soft, flickering glow just beyond the reach of her vision. It was like a candle's flame, barely visible, but enough to offer a shred of hope in the overwhelming darkness. Without thinking, Sarah scrambled toward it, her body moving on instinct. She had to reach the light. It had to be a way out. The growls behind her grew louder, more insistent, and the shrieking sound intensified, becoming a cacophony of torment. As she reached the source of the light, she found herself standing before a towering, twisted gate. The glow was coming from a series of intricate runes etched into the stone archway. The symbols pulsed with an eerie energy, casting an unsettling light on the surrounding darkness. A voice, low and distorted, echoed from the depths of the gate, a sound that seemed to come from all around her. "Do you seek to escape, Sarah?" The voice sent a shiver down her spine, and she instinctively took a step back. She tried to speak, but her words caught in her throat. What was this place? Who was speaking to her? "Escape is not for the weak," the voice continued, each word laced with a sinister tone. "Those who cross the threshold must pay the price." A horrible realization dawned on Sarah. This wasn't just a gate. It was a barrier, a test. A door that led deeper into the underworld, one that required a sacrifice to pass through. The runes pulsed more intensely now, their light casting grotesque shadows that danced across the ground. She hesitated, her mind torn between fear and desperation. Was there any way out of this place? Or was she doomed to remain here forever, caught between the world of the living and the horrors of the underworld. The growl behind her reached a deafening crescendo, and she spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. The creatures were closing in. The voice spoke again, its tone mocking. "Time is running out, Sarah. Make your choice,